Okay, welcome back to the 2S Horror Quarters podcast, another Ghosts of LA edition. I want to thank you for joining me again, and today we are going to cover what I consider to be the ghost of LA. Now, Los Angeles, I know, has a history of hundreds of thousands and millions of tragic stories, but in the true crime community and the true crime world, especially in Los Angeles, to me, this is the ghost of LA, and we are talking about Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia, who on January 15th, 1947, was found cut in half in a vacant lot on South Norton Avenue. I know there are a lot of theories. A lot of people have written books, done interviews, claiming it was a family member that did it, or their father, or their great-grandfather, or their brother. I mean, sky's the limit when it comes to the theories, and I'm not discounting any of those theories, but this particular episode, I'll cover a few of those theories that I kind of lean towards being plausible, and we'll cover a few of those. It was a cold, clear Wednesday, kind of a brisk morning in the Leimert Park section of Los Angeles, and one of the residents, a Betty Bersinger, was heading southbound on a walk, pushing a stroller with her 3-year-old daughter Anne in it, and they were headed to a shoe repair shop to get a few things for Betty's husband. It was about 10 a.m. and again southbound on the west side of the street there, walking along the sidewalk. Now, there were homes to the north of this vacant lot, and there were homes to the south of this vacant lot. And because of the war, a lot of the construction, not only in this area, but other areas across the country, probably stopped. So this particular block would be the 3800 block of South Norton Avenue. And during the walk, Betty mentioned that there was some broken glass on the concrete, so she maneuvers around it. And as she's maneuvering around the glass, she kind of glances and sees something off to her right in the grass and in the weeds there, because these vacant lots had grass and kind of overgrown weeds, a lot of dirt, a lot of rubbish that people have thrown in there. And what she saw appeared to her to be a mannequin cut in two, a mannequin that is very pale, very white. And she knew something wasn't right. And looking around, it was the time of day that kids were outside riding bikes, running around, playing, and Betty thought, well, this could scare some of the kids, and something didn't feel right about it. So she continues on her walk, pushing the stroller south, crosses the street there, and knocks on the first door across the street and gets no answer. Moves on to the second house and gets an answer, and then that's when the call was made to LAPD. The call came in at approximately 10:55 a.m. Betty said, and I quote, "My goodness, it was so white. It didn't look like anything more than perhaps an artificial model. It was so white and separated in the middle. I noticed the dark hair and this white form." Here we are at 3705 South Norton Avenue. This is Betty Bersinger's home. So you can kind of see in relation to where Elizabeth was found. Here is an aerial shot of the distance between Betty's house and where Elizabeth was found, which was roughly 1,110 feet south of Betty's house. Here's a shot of the direction Betty Bersinger was walking. And this is heading southbound again on the west side of the street. Now, on the audio interview that Betty Bersinger gave, there was a little bit of confusion as to which house she knocked on and which house that someone answered the door. Now, I know it has been documented that she knocked on the first door across the street there. No one answered. And then the second house, when she knocked, someone did answer. And then from there, the phone call was made to police. But like I said, in Betty's interview, she had a little bit of confusion as to which house it was, because it had been so long since that day to when the interview was conducted. Now here are those first two houses on the corner. I know 75 years ago things were probably a lot different, but to the best of my knowledge, these were the homes that she was referring to. Now for the sake of Elizabeth and for the guidelines of the YouTube channel, I will not be showing these photos in their graphic detail. There are plenty of opportunities online if anyone wants to look at these photos. Just look it up and you'll see them in their entirety. I do warn you though, if you have not seen them, they are quite disturbing. So again, I will not be showing those photos in their graphic detail on this particular episode. So the call was placed at 10:55 a.m. and at approximately 11:07 a.m. the first two responding officers arrived. One Frank Perkins and one Will Fitzgerald. And as the morning progressed, as more police and authorities arrived, so did the word of mouth in the streets, so did the press. And at the time there were 4 competing newspapers to get photos, to get interviews, to try to get the scoop. So the place itself became somewhat of a circus. Here are the lead detectives on the case. Harry Hansen on the left, Finest Brown on the right. And then here are some other photos. Like I said, I'm not going to show the mutilated pictures. I'm going to blur them out, but I just want you to see the positioning of Elizabeth at this point. And here is the street now, present time. It's just a regular neighborhood on Norton Avenue. And you can see here on the right about the corner here where the grass is where she lay. 54 feet north of this hydrant, and about 3 feet off to the left there is where she was, which puts her here, right about the corner of this grass. Once all photos were taken, all documentations were noted, all evidence collected, photographed, Elizabeth's body was loaded into an aluminum coffin and into the coroner's vehicle, which at the time coincidentally was called Black Maria. Black Maria then headed downtown to the Hall of Justice where the morgue was located. There Elizabeth was taken out of the vehicle and weighed on some ground level scales. It wasn't until the following day, January 16th, that the autopsy was performed by Dr. Frederick Newbar. And Dr. Newbar has seen probably thousands of bodies and conducted probably thousands of autopsies at the time, but never had seen anything like this, nor had anyone else around. This was something new, something so grotesque that it was something that you couldn't even make up. Dr. Newbar was the chief autopsy surgeon for LA County at the time. Elizabeth's body was laid across the autopsy table, and her head was propped up by a wooden block. The final report, though gruesome, was quite informative in the context of the investigation. Female, obviously, between 15 to 20 years of age, height 5'5", and weighing approximately 115 pounds. Multiple lacerations to the facial area inflicted most likely by a sharp instrument, such as a knife or a blade of some sort. From each corner of the mouth outward, there were lacerations of over 3 inches long, forming that Joker-like smile. There were depressed ridges and indentations on Elizabeth's wrists, and this suggested that she was strung up somewhere while being tortured. Dr. Newbar's findings stated that the lacerations to the face and blows to Elizabeth's skull were inflicted while she was still alive. The face lividity, postmortem lividity, suggested that at some point after death, Elizabeth was face down. It's to be noted too that Elizabeth's body was drained of blood. Now, depending on what you read and who you may talk to about the case, they do mention that potentially there were 1 or 2 droplets there of blood, diluted drops. One was over a heel print and one in an empty cement bag. All other lacerations were said to have been inflicted after death. There were these crisscross type patterns etched on Elizabeth's body in a few places, and the pubic region was one of those places. It was like a tic-tac-toe type of drawing. Dr. Newbar, based on his report, suggested death had occurred within 24 hours or less. Also on Elizabeth's body, in some of the crevices, there were some cocoa fibers found, like from a cocoa fiber brush. So apparently she had been cleaned off, brushed off. Now, I have researched this and read that there were 3 things that police kept close to the vest that they didn't want the public to know, and this kind of weeds out all the people claiming to have done this. Where one, Elizabeth had a rose tattoo on her left thigh that was cut out and placed into the vaginal cavity. Two, the pubic hair, some of her pubic hair, was shoved into her anal cavity. And again, this stuff is disturbing. Police had to keep that quiet to see if they found anyone that would know those two things. There were various scratches that appeared on Elizabeth's left breast, while a square piece of tissue was removed from Elizabeth's right breast. It was also noted that she had old scar tissue, probably from a previous operation. Now, police also noted that there was dew on Elizabeth's back. Because dew on that particular morning would have been there between 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., the timetable would have been anywhere between 2 and 6 as to when she was placed there. Now, after this, police needed to identify who she was, and at the time, there were no fax machines. So there was a machine owned by one of the papers that they called a sound photo machine, and the process is they take pictures of each fingerprint on Elizabeth and send that through the sound photo machine to the FBI, where the FBI at the time had to look through it pretty much manually. And not every photo made it okay. I mean, there were, I think, 6 to 7 of the photos of her fingerprints were blurred, so I think there were only 2 usable ones. At any rate, they were able to find 2 matches for Elizabeth Short, and it didn't take that long at all, within a couple of hours. There were 2 hits for Elizabeth Short's fingerprints. One of them came from the U.S. Army's Camp Cook in Lompoc, California. Elizabeth once had a job there. And the second hit came from Santa Barbara. Elizabeth was arrested for underage drinking, though they say she wasn't drinking, that she was just in this group of people, but she was underage nonetheless at the El Paseo restaurant in Santa Barbara, and she was booked right across the street from that restaurant at police headquarters. Elizabeth and the arresting officer, Mary Unkefer, walked across the street, and Elizabeth was booked and processed there. This is where the famous mugshot, where Elizabeth's kind of staring right through you with those gray eyes, the black and white photo, this is where that was taken, in Santa Barbara. And Mary actually ended up taking Elizabeth in for a few days to help her out, and then sending her back to Medford. The date was September 23rd, 1943, that Elizabeth was arrested here at this restaurant called El Paseo in Santa Barbara, and the charge was underage drinking. Now, it's been said and noted that she wasn't actually drinking, but she was in the company of a group that was drinking. So she was arrested. The arresting officer, as mentioned before, was a Mary Unkefer, who walked her across the street to here, City Hall. Now, 75 years ago, I know a lot of this looked different. So based on what I'm seeing here, either Elizabeth walked across this crosswalk here or the one over here. I'm going to guess that she was booked back here, away from the street. This other entrance here looks like just a main entrance at the time. But either way, this is City Hall, and this is where that famous mug shot was taken. The famous black and white mug shot of Elizabeth, where she's got those gray eyes just staring right through you. So what we find out about Elizabeth Short is that she was born on July 29th, 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was the middle child of 5 girls, to Cleo and Phoebe Short. In 1926, the family upped and moved to Medford. And not too long after that, their father Cleo left the family. They found his car parked near a bridge in town, so it was assumed that he jumped and killed himself. Well, that wasn't the case. They ran into him later on. He pretty much faked his suicide. It's been reported that Phoebe walked right into him in town. Him bumping back into the family led to Elizabeth and her father, rekindling their relationship, and she ended up moving first to Vallejo with her father. That didn't work out too well, and apparently she only lasted about 3 weeks with her dad before he ended up kicking her out. After she left her dad's spot in Vallejo, she moved in with some friends and got the job at Camp Cook. So while she was working at Camp Cook, she ended up meeting a sergeant, and this guy apparently put hands on her, and she broke up with him, and then she moved on to Santa Barbara, where she lived with somebody else on Montecito Street. And she had only been there a week before she got arrested at the El Paseo restaurant and booked across the street at City Hall, where the police station was. So like I mentioned before, the arresting officer, Mary Unkerford, took Elizabeth in for a few days and ended up giving her money for a bus back to Medford. Once she was in Medford for a little while, she didn't stay long. She soon left to Florida. While in Florida, she met a guy from the Air Force named Matt Gordon. They dated for a while and they were engaged. Unfortunately, Matt Gordon had to return to active duty in 1945, where he subsequently was shot down and killed in India. And of course, this left Elizabeth distraught. So Elizabeth moved on. She dated a lot, particularly men in uniform. After a short stint in Indianapolis and Chicago, Elizabeth made her way back to California, Long Beach specifically, in pursuit of Gordon Fickling. Gordon Fickling was an Air Force lieutenant and stationed in Long Beach. So this story was an extremely hot story. It was the OJ of the day. It was the Sharon Tate, LaBianca, Manson family story of the time. But before the internet, obviously, so the city was frantic. The newspapers were selling like hotcakes. But still, there wasn't a lot of information outside of, slain girl, cut in half, found in vacant lot. Werewolf slain is what they called it at one point too. So police were desperate for any kind of information as to who did it, when, why, how, so on and so forth. The story began to fizzle out. It was on January 23rd that the city editor, Jimmy Richardson, received a phone call from a stranger, essentially, a strange man on the other end. Asked Jimmy, what's your name? Jimmy responds, Richardson. The man on the other end says, you've done a great job with the Dahlia case, but it appears you're running out of stuff. The man on the other end responds to Jimmy by congratulating him on his work on the Dahlia case. Then the man says, you seem to have run out of material. Jimmy's like, yeah. The guy on the other end says, perhaps I can be of assistance with that. And Jimmy says, we need it. And the mystery man responds with, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send you some of the things she had with her when she, shall we say, disappeared. Jimmy's like, what kinds of things? To which he responds, her address book, birth certificate, and a few other things. Jimmy all the while was trying to have the phone call traced. Fast forward to 2 days later, Jimmy gets a call from the postal inspector, and they tell Jimmy that a package addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner was intercepted there by police, and they're getting ready to open it up. They open it up, and they find that there are various newspaper clippings used to form the words on the letter. And the package itself reeked heavily of gasoline. So when the package was opened down at the post office, there were some interesting things uncovered. And it turns out it was sent on the 24th, which would have been the day after the phone call to Jimmy. The envelope read, here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow. It contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, her social security card, a claim check card from the Greyhound station dated January 9th, which would have been for 2 suitcases and 1 hat box. There was a telegram in there from the Railway Express in regards to another trunk, which we'll get to. Business cards, multiple photographs of Elizabeth with various men in uniform, and a brown leather notebook containing names and numbers of different people. Now, depending on what you read or who you ask, it could be 1 page, it could be several pages, but I'm just going to go with several pages here were torn out of this address book for whatever reason. And on the cover of this particular book, the numbers 1937 and the name Mark Hansen appeared. Now remember, the package stated that there would be a letter to follow. Well, the following day, a letter came in. And it read, "Here it is. Turning in Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia Avenger." Authorities made a note that it appeared the letter had been written with a new ballpoint pen. Now, at the time, ballpoint pens weren't cheap. I think they went for around $6 back then, so not everybody had them, which, isn't a huge clue, but it's definitely substantial. So it was here on January 24th, 1947, that one high heel and a purse were found in a dumpster at a cafe that once stood here. The cafe address at the time was 1136 Crenshaw Boulevard. I cannot find 1136 Crenshaw, but I did find 1132 and 1140, which is what's pictured here. So in this general vicinity, a man by the name of Robert Hymans found and reported the shoe and purse in a dumpster somewhere here. And by the time the police got there, the dumpster was already removed. So police had to sift through the dump to locate those items. And here is Red Manley identifying those items and linking them to Elizabeth Short. So in my research, I read a lot of books regarding this case, a lot of articles, listened to a lot of information, be it podcasts or interviews, TV specials. So I know that there's no one solid answer. I mean, there's going to be different things that I've heard versus what you've heard, and I'm not trying to sell what I'm saying as concrete. I just kind of try to sift through different scenarios, different things, and maybe you can just decide for yourself what you think happened. When reconstructing Elizabeth's timeline, authorities, researchers were kind of stumped as to why Elizabeth went down to San Diego 1 month before she died. I know she was kind of nomadic, so maybe she just decided, she was at her wit's end, with men, with life. She was staying at different hotels, motels, people's houses, people's rooms, rooming houses. Maybe it was time for her to just, out of frustration, to get out of LA. At any rate, she ends up in San Diego on December 8th, 1946, and she is found inside of the Aztec Theater by one of the employees there by the name of Dorothy French. She said Elizabeth was sleeping. Now, at the time, the Aztec Theater did attract a lot of the homeless. All we can do is speculate as to what led Elizabeth down there. Maybe she heard that the Aztec Theater can put her up for a night. Who knows? Whatever her reasons, she ended up there. Dorothy French, who was a cashier there, befriended her, talked, and invited her to live with her and her mother nearby, an Elvira French. While she stayed at the French's house for about 30 days, she kind of wore out her welcome. It's been said that she slept in a lot. She kept weird hours, and it was time for her to go at one point. Here is 665 Fifth Avenue, San Diego, California, at what was once the Aztec Theater. I don't know what years these particular photos are from, probably the 70s to the 90s, something like that, but back then it was the Aztec Theater as well. And to me, this is one of the most interesting parts of the case, because this is where she upped and left LA for whatever reason. 1 month before she was killed, came all the way down to San Diego for reasons unknown. I had to go visit this place because, like I said, it's a pivotal point. Here it is today. It's the Urban Outfitters, and just envisioning her walking in here, probably depressed, alone, lost. You kind of get a sense of her loneliness, or her unsureness in life to up and move from LA and head way down here. This interested me a lot as to why. I guess we'll never know that, but here's the building. During this time in San Diego, when she was walking right across the street from the Western Airlines at the time, a man by the name of Robert Red Manley was driving by. pulled over and attempted to pick her up. She didn't take too kindly of it right away, but ended up getting in the car with him, and they took a drive, and he dropped her off later on at the French's house. Robert was a married man, but he was out there, While she was staying at the French's, Robert Manley sent her a telegram saying he was going to pick her up on January 8th and that he wanted to see her. So that day came. Robert picks her up. Elizabeth leaves the French's house for the last time, and with her, in her possession, were 2 suitcases and 1 hat box. She gets in the car with Robert, and they take off. They end up spending the night at the Swallows Inn in San Juan Capistrano. The Swallows Inn is still there, but it's not in the same location. It's across the street now, and I think it's more of a bar lunch place at this point. But apparently at that time it was a motel, and luckily for the sake of the case and for Elizabeth, the motel worker jotted down the license plate of Robert's car. So from the telegram being sent to Elizabeth, reporters and investigators were able to track down where the telegram came from, and from that it moved on to who this guy was, and they got that information from the Swallows Inn employee who jotted down Red's license plate. So Jimmy Richardson and his boys, they end up going to Robert Manley's home, knocking on his door. He's not home. His wife Harriet, who's holding their little baby, answers the door. They tell her what's going on. She denies that he would have anything to do with such a crime and that he came home that night on January 9th. But on that current night, that he was out of town with his boss and he would be back later. So on January 19th, Robert Manley was arrested in Eagle Rock at the home of his boss. So based on what I found records-wise, here is the house that Red Manley was arrested at. This would have been his boss's house in Eagle Rock. So back to Red and Elizabeth on the 8th of January. On the 9th of January, Elizabeth asked Red to drive her to the Biltmore in Los Angeles. She was going to meet her sister, Virginia, there. Initially, she just wanted Red to drop her off, but he knows the area. He knows it's the bad part of town, so he said, let me just go with you. Takes her to the Biltmore, and he stays with her for a little while. She goes and freshens up. So in the meantime, Red is looking for Elizabeth's sister, Virginia, who Elizabeth described. He goes and asks some of the employees. He's looking around the lobby, and no one matches the description. Eventually, Red leaves her there. So Elizabeth was seen there in the lobby between the hours of 6:30 to 10 o'clock. They said she went to the Western Union desk at one point. She made a couple of calls at another point. Why she was there, I don't know. I mean, they asked her sister if she was supposed to meet her there, and she said no. So why the Biltmore? Was it just to get away from Red? Was it really to meet someone else? I mean, these are things we'll never know, but these are the important questions in my mind. So as most of us, if not all of us who are interested in this case, has heard the story of a doorman opening the door of the Biltmore for Elizabeth, tipping his cap, and she walks away down Olive Street into the fog. Now that may be true, but in the DA's files from the LAPD summary of the case, and I'm taking this directly from the LA Daily Mirror, shout out to them, but this is directly from them, and this is a statement. Again, this is a statement from the DA's files. Quote, she was observed alone by employees of the Biltmore until approximately 10 p.m. January 9th. Mr. Studholme of the Biltmore Hotel stated that he observed the girl get up from the lobby as if she had been signaled by someone on the outside and walk out of the Olive Street entrance. He last saw her walking south towards 6th Street on Olive on the west side of the street. Investigators were unable to determine whether she made a phone call while there or not, but witnesses state they observed her on several occasions go toward the telephone booth. Unquote. One of the theories that some have considered kind of far-fetched, but I think it's something you got to look at, is the theory of Leslie Dillon and the Astor Motel. An author by the name of Pio Eatwell, I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, wrote a book in 2017 titled Black Dahlia, Red Rose. And I got to tell you, it's a good read. It's a solid read. Whether or not the stuff in there is true, I don't know, but it's very compelling the way she puts it together. According to Eatwell, the criminal psychiatrist for the LAPD, a Dr. Paul DeRiver, set a trap for whoever the killer of Elizabeth was in a magazine called True Detective. He set the trap in an article he wrote, hoping to kind of weed out whoever did it. And before long, a letter arrived at Dr. DeRiver's office coming from someone by the name of Jack Sand. And essentially, Jack Sand claims in the letter that he knows who killed the Black Dahlia, and it is a friend of his by the name of Jeff Connors. So as correspondence continued between Dr. DeRiver and this Jack Sand, we come to find out the real identity of Jack Sand is Leslie Dillon. So as it turned out, the doctor and gangster squad, Detective J.J. O'Mara, finally got together with this Leslie Dillon and tried to get more information out of him. Apparently, he knew the two details that the cops were keeping close to the vest in regards to what was done with the tattoo and what was done with the pubic hair. While interviewing Leslie Dillon, he suggested that the murder was done in a bathtub to drain the blood. So Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen, according to Eatwell's book, were somehow seen and spotted at the Astor Motel, as well as a woman matching the description of Elizabeth Short. Also, the book talks about how the owners of the Astor Motel walked into cabin 3 and saw that there was a lot of blood and fecal matter spread out. As to why they didn't report to police, in my mind, I don't know. According to the owner, he did not want to deal with the police at that time, but to me, when you walk into a cabin filled with blood and fecal matter, it's something that I would call police for, This theory, though, is wildly contested by Black Dahlia researchers, including Larry Harnish. Larry Harnish unequivocally states that Leslie Dillon was no doubt about it in San Francisco the night of the murder. So none of these things in the book really matter. But for me, I just say take a look at it if you're into the case. See if you like the theory, see if it grabs you. But nonetheless, it was a good read, and you might enjoy it. Now, here is the motel in question, the Astor Motel that still stands today. I want to thank Ralfa, Palomo, for going out there and getting this footage of the motel, of cabin 3, and the parking lot and everything else. For those that believe the Leslie Dillon theory, this is pretty interesting to take a look at. LAPD's chief forensic specialist, Ray Pinker, and his boys did come and test the rooms here, including cabin 3 at the Astor Motel back then. And the only blood that was found, if I remember correctly, was droplets from when a woman was menstruating. But as far as any trace evidence or any detection of any other blood at the time, it was negative. Now let's talk about Mark Hansen. He was the co-owner of the Florentine Gardens, which still stands there today. Mark had a house nearby to the Florentine Gardens on the back street there on Carlos Avenue, 6024 Carlos Avenue. And it was there that quite a number of the Florentine Garden dancers and entertainers, females mostly, would stay and room there, including Elizabeth Short. And based on another roommate there by the name of Ann Toth, who became a close friend of Elizabeth's, Mark Hansen took a liking to Elizabeth Short. Now, according to him, she didn't mean much to him. According to him, he kicked her out a couple of times, but it has been noted and it has been stated that he had a thing for her. He did take her in a couple of times to stay at his house, but he also did kick her out. Now, he claims the last time he saw her was December 8th. Mark Hansen stated that at one point he had to kick out Elizabeth and her friend Marjorie because Marjorie was drunk a lot, and Elizabeth would bring a lot of undesirables to the house, strange men, according to Mark Hansen, and it just wasn't right, so he had to get them out of there. We do know, at least it's been noted, that in October, Elizabeth stayed at Hanson's house, October of 1946. So clearly, to me, it shows they had some type of relationship. But there was something there that allowed Mark to allow Elizabeth to stay at the house. According to Ann Toth, she stated that Elizabeth told her that Mark is trying to make her, and that Elizabeth told her she would sometimes have to leave her boyfriends or whoever she had with her at the time outside or down the street so Mark didn't see them. Mark did become somewhat of a suspect and was involved in the grand jury investigation, but they couldn't prove anything. Now, probably one of the more popular theories comes from retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel. Steve Hodel claims that his father, George Hodel, is the murderer of Elizabeth Short. And it's quite an extensive investigation that Steve has done, and a lot of work has been put into it. So I commend him for that. When George died, Steve started going through his belongings, sifting through stuff. And what sparked this investigation, or this theory, was that Steve found 2 photos of a woman who he thinks is Elizabeth Short. And from there, it just snowballed into a deeper investigation of his father. So Stephen eventually filed what's called a Freedom of Information Act, and this gave him access to the FBI files on the murder of Elizabeth Short. Steve also found a folder containing receipts that dated back to when his father had contract work done at the house, and these receipts showed that the concrete bought for the contracting work was the same brand and size as the empty concrete sack found at the dump site on Norton Avenue. Now, this house here, known as the John Sowden House at 5121 Franklin Avenue, is Steve Hodel's childhood home. And this house here is a popular fixture when it comes to the Black Dahlia case because of its link to George Hodel. They also call this house the Jaws house because of the Jaws-like fixtures above the door there. According to Steve, a hemicorectomy, I think I'm saying that correctly, was the type of cut used on Elizabeth. And that type of procedure is where you can slice a body in half without breaking any bones. And apparently it was taught sometime in the 1930s when his father was in medical school. Another red flag for Steve was that George's handwriting was very similar to the handwriting in the letters sent to the police. It's also claimed by Steve that her uterus was removed, which I haven't seen in any other reports. Not saying it's not true, but I just haven't seen it. So based on all of that information that Steve presented, it's kind of compelling, just depending on what you believe happened. I mean, there's some stuff in there you definitely got to think about. Probably my favorite theory would be the one by Larry Harnish. Larry Harnish is a former LA Times copy editor and writer. To me, this would make the most plausible sense. He explains it in really good detail on Feast of Death, which is a documentary on James Ellroy and his life and the unsolved murder of James Ellroy's mother, Geneva, which is another podcast that I did, Ghost of LA edition. You might want to check that one out. It's still unsolved, and it happened June 22nd, 1958. It's not as popular, or nowhere near as popular as this case, but those 2 murders are pretty similar. At any rate, on Feast of Death, which is a very well done project, Larry Harnish is sitting amongst LA detectives, and with Nick Nolte and with James Ellroy, and they're eating and talking about cases and stuff. And Larry Harnish is getting kind of ribbed by the detectives because they're kicking around some of his theories. They're asking questions that he doesn't really factor in his theory. Now, during Larry's investigation of Elizabeth Short's murder, people were sending him things, and he tells a story where a box came in. He opens it up, and inside of it was a marriage certificate for Virginia Short. Now, Virginia was Elizabeth's older sister. Virginia was getting married to a guy by the name of Adrian West. So, towards the bottom of this marriage certificate, is a name, Barbara Lindgren, and an address, 3959 Norton, which is 1 block from where they found Elizabeth. So we dug a lot deeper and found that the woman who owned the house, or who at least was paying taxes on the house, was a woman by the name of Ruth Bailey. Ruth Bailey was the mother of Barbara Lindgren. Ruth Bailey was married to one Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was a surgeon, former chief of staff at LA County, and an associate professor of surgery at USC. So now you have a very, very solid connection between Elizabeth Short and Barbara Lindgren. That would be Virginia Short. And that's more than a coincidence in my opinion. And I encourage you to watch Feast of Death. Larry really lays it down, the levels of the research into this case, the levels of what he found out. Here's a Google Earth shot showing you the distance from Walter Bailey's house to where Elizabeth was found, and it was roughly 1,366 feet away. Pretty close. We'll call it 1 block. There's a series of pictures, popular pictures, that shows Elizabeth in much happier times. She's posing for these photos at John Marshall High School, in the front of John Marshall High School, at 3939 Tracy Street in Los Angeles. It is said that these photos were taken October 23rd or October 24th of 1946, when Elizabeth was 22 years old. Obviously, I cannot prove that. It looks about right. She looks to be in her early 20s. And it is one of the sites that myself and our co-producer, Ralfa, went and visited to get more of a sense of the footsteps that Elizabeth walked. And here we are in front of the school, trying to get as close as we can to where she actually stood and sat. More or less, the high school looks the same. I'm sure it's had a lot of renovation. Matter of fact, we tried to get these same photos probably 6 to 8 months before we got these, and there was heavy construction going on. Everything was fenced off, but nonetheless, here we are at John Marshall High School, the famous location of not only a lot of movies and celebrities and things are associated with the school, but Elizabeth Short taking these photos there is definitely high on that list. Now here we are at the former location of the Washington Hotel at 53 Linden Avenue in Long Beach. Thanks to Jose for going out and grabbing this footage up for me last minute. This building here is where Elizabeth Short lived with Gordon Fickling in late July to early August of 46. Just about a half a block up at 102 Linden Avenue was Landers Drugstore. It was owned by a man named Arnold Landers, and I've heard so many different stories on where the Black Dahlia moniker derived from. I didn't really want to get into that, but I found it interesting that there's a documented quote by Arnold Landers, who owned Landers Drugstore, in regards to the name the Black Dahlia. Quote, "She'd come into our drugstore frequently. She'd usually wear a two-piece beach costume which left her midriff bare, or she'd wear the black lacy things. Her hair was jet black, and she liked to wear it high. She was popular with the men who came in here, and they got to calling her the Black Dahlia." End quote. The movie The Blue Dahlia had just come out in April of 1946, so maybe that was just a popular thing at the time, and that extended to Elizabeth being called the Black Dahlia because of her liking to black clothing and her jet black hair. Just a guess. Well, I want to thank you for joining me on this particular episode. It was one that I was looking forward to getting to, especially with the 75-year anniversary approaching. One of the most fascinating cases, and the fact that it's unsolved just adds another layer to that. I don't think it has the potential to fizzle away. It seems to be getting stronger every year, with all these theories and reports, and especially the crime scene photos and the morgue photos. They are disturbing, but I think if you truly want to get enveloped in this case, you need to see those photos. But again, thank you for the time, and we'll see you on the next one. Okay, welcome back to another episode of 2S, the Horror Quarters podcast. This is another Ghosts of LA edition, and we're going to be covering the Onion murder, which culminated and began in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, near the Florentine Gardens. Carlos Avenue and Gower, particularly, was where the incident occurred, and it is now named after Ian Campbell, the officer who lost his life in Bakersfield. But it all started on March 9th, 1963, approximately 10 p.m. So officers Ian Campbell and Carl Hettinger were in their unmarked Plymouth 6Z4 plainclothes unit vehicle, and they were patrolling in the area of Carlos Avenue and Gower, particularly in an alley. At this point, they were coming down an alley onto Carlos Avenue. Now, looking at Carlos Avenue now from Google Earth, or even if you go to Carlos Avenue, you can see there is alleyways on each side of the street, one on the north side of Carlos, one on the south side of Carlos. The book didn't specify which alley the officers were heading down as they approached Carlos. I'm going to guess they were heading southbound towards Carlos from that alley. And that is what the movie shows, if I saw that right. So as they approached Carlos from that alley, right around the same time, there were two criminals in a 1946 maroon Ford coupe. A guy by the name of Gregory Powell was driving, and the other guy was named Jimmy Lee Smith in the passenger seat. Now, as the Ford coupe headed westbound on Carlos, it approached a street called Vista Del Mar, and for whatever reason, the driver, Powell, thought that the street dead-ended. So he makes a U-turn on Carlos to head back eastbound towards Gower. And that's where the two officers spotted him, and they looked out of place. The plates were out-of-state plates, and the two men inside of the vehicle were wearing black coats with black snap hats. Just looked out of place, especially that time of night, cruising the way they were. So Campbell got behind the coupe and, looking for a reason to pull them over, they noticed that the light was out on the license plate area. They pulled him over as they made a right onto Gower. And you can see the southwest corner of Gower heading southbound is where they pulled him over at. Officer Campbell gets out of the vehicle on the driver's side. Officer Hettinger on the passenger side. Jimmy Lee Smith on the passenger side of the coupe gets out and puts his hands up without being told to do so. Now, both officers only had their flashlights in their hands. No weapons were drawn at this point. So as Hettinger approaches Jimmy Smith is like, "Hey, what's the problem?" And then on the other side, in the street side of the cars, Officer Campbell approaches Gregory Powell and asked him to see his license. So Powell, noticing that Campbell only had a flashlight on him, turns to his right and backs out of the car. And in doing so, he grabs his weapon, turns it, and has the gun pointed at Ian Campbell. He gets behind Officer Campbell and now has the gun in his back. Now they come around the vehicle onto the sidewalk area, and this is where Officer Hettinger notices that something's not right here. Officer Campbell is in front of the suspect, not behind him, and it was a surreal moment. Now, as Officer Campbell confirms to Officer Hettinger that there is a gun in his back, Powell yells to Smith to get Hettinger's weapon. And it was at this point that Officer Campbell told Officer Hettinger to give up your gun. So now Powell and Smith had all four guns in their possession, and they were directed to get into the vehicle. Officer Hettinger was forced to go in the back on the floor behind the driver's seat and keep his hands as high as he can, or enough where they can be seen at all times. He was crouched and cramped, very uncomfortable in the back seat. In the front seat, Powell had Officer Campbell get behind the wheel. Powell then sat in the middle with a gun pointed in Campbell's stomach. Next to Powell sat Jimmy Lee Smith. Jimmy Lee Smith's task was to watch Officer Hettinger in the back for the whole ride up. So before they took off, Powell told Jimmy Smith to get out, go move the police car up a little closer to the curb so it doesn't look as conspicuous. Jimmy Smith goes to the car but can't figure out how to move it and comes back to the coupe and gets in and tells Powell, hey, he couldn't figure it out. Now, both officers had Model 14s, 6-inch barrel Smith & Wessons. Once Smith got back into the vehicle, Powell asked Officer Campbell, does he know how to get to Bakersfield? Officer Campbell said yes. So Officer Campbell made a U-turn on Gower, headed north, made a left onto the 101 North, which probably would have been Franklin. Now here we're facing westbound on Carlos Avenue. And in the distance here is Vista Del Mar. And even now it looks like a dead end. I mean, they have a crossbar across the street now. Really, the street continues on. But just the way the street looks, it appears to be a dead end, but it is not. This apartment building back then was not here. But had they made a left here, it would have taken them to Hollywood Boulevard. So this is what it would have been like if Powell would have made a right on Vista Del Mar instead of U-turning. I don't know exactly where that leads. Because Powell thought it was a dead end, he U-turned and headed back eastbound towards Gower, and this would have been his view. Now, based on what I can see, the two alleys are pretty much right across from each other. Here's an alley here to the left, and then here's another alley to the right. In the book, it's just mentioned as an alley. The officers come out of an alley onto Carlos Avenue, just as Powell and Smith are crossing. So, based on my estimations, it would have been probably in this general area. They approach the light. Officer Campbell and Hettinger light him up, pull him over, and they make a right onto Gower and pull over onto Gower into this area here. Here we are at the intersection of Carlos Avenue and Gower Street. And this is where the abduction started. You could see here would have been where Officer Campbell and Officer Hettinger's car was parked. And right about here would have been where Powell and Jimmy Lee Smith's vehicle was parked. And we're looking westbound at this point at the southwest corner of Gower and Carlos. So I'm getting a little closer here. We just went not too long ago to the area. I wanted to get a feel for the area and get my eyes on the actual area where it happened. I definitely like to visit these locations. It gets me a better feel of what happened, at least on my take of what happened. So right about in this area here is where it all started. Jimmy Smith would have been probably right about here when he had his hands up and had the interaction with Officer Hettinger. On the other side of the vehicle, Officer Campbell and Powell had their interaction, where of course Powell got the drop on Officer Campbell and had him at gunpoint. So Ian Campbell would have made a U-turn here and headed north on Gower and passed up the First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood here and approached the nearest on-ramp, which I believe would have been Franklin. In the movie, the traffic stop was here. It was on Carlos Avenue. I don't know why that would be. If I had to guess, it would be probably because it was safer, maybe permit issues. But whatever case, the actual traffic stop scene was here, right about this area here, just before the alley. Now, at the time in 1963, the 101 North didn't get you to the Grapevine. They had to hit the 101 North, exit Sepulveda, and take that for a ways to get to the Grapevine area. They took the Grapevine up over into Bakersfield. Now, Bakersfield was an area that Jimmy Smith was familiar with, and Smith and Powell were in that area earlier that day, which we'll get into later in this episode. There wasn't much talk inside of the vehicle on the way up. Greg Powell asked the officers how much money they had. Officer Campbell said he had $10, I believe, and then Officer Hettinger had $8 or $9. And Ian mentioned to Powell that, hey, that's enough money to get those two guys to Frisco if they were to just let the officers go. But Powell wasn't falling for that, and they continued their drive on. Officer Campbell was asked why he pulled them over, and he said because of the light around the license plate. Once they got to an area called the Maricopa Turnoff, this is where they exited and headed west. They headed west for just a little bit, and on the left-hand side, head southbound, was a dirt road. They passed the dirt road and then U-turned back to it and then made a right, headed south into these open fields, these open onion fields at the time. Now, in the distance, though it was pretty dark out there and open and almost deserted, even though there was a lot of crops and stuff, but at that time of night, it was pretty lonely up there. But there was a farmhouse in the distance. Gregory Powell mentioned to the officers that once he drops them off, they can make their way to that farmhouse and call for help. So there was a little bit of hope there in the car at this point for the two officers. Now, heading southbound on this dirt road, they crossed a couple of roads. Now, there were some parts where the dirt there was a little choppy, a little soft, but they approached an open ditch. And what that open ditch was the gas company had dug that ditch to lay a gas pipe in, but they hadn't filled it back in yet. So the coupe couldn't continue on. So Powell ordered Officer Campbell to stop, make a U-turn, and just face north, face the way that they came down. And at one point, Powell even threatened Ian and told him, "You get this car stuck, you're both dead." Here's a shot of us looking east on Maricopa Highway. Out there in the distance, you would make a right. That would be the dirt road that Ian Campbell went down and headed southbound towards where they eventually stopped and U-turned. We're just over the area where the car stopped at. So Officer Campbell would have been driving the car southbound towards us and stopping just about where we flew over. Even today, there's a gas marker off to the right, somewhere where I'm standing there. I'll show another shot of it so you can see. And this is the area where the trench would have been, and the reason why Officer Campbell had to make the U-turn and stop the vehicle. That's me walking northbound on the road in the general area of where they stopped. I mean, that was 59 years ago. I'm sure a lot of this changed, and based on what I've seen in my calculations and research, the area would have been somewhere next to this tower to the right here. Back then, these trees weren't there. Shout out to Forrest Haggerty and his channel. Forrest Haggerty has an excellent channel where he goes over cases and murders and crimes, but he does it via Google Earth. And he really lays it out for you of how things look now versus then, and how the streets are then versus now. I always look at the telephone poles if they're within the vicinity, because I can tell what year they were put in. So just to check here, these particular poles were put in 1993, so these were not the original poles that were there that night. So slowly and carefully, Officer Campbell made the turn, faced the car north, and parked. Powell has Ian turn the headlights off and orders Jimmy Smith to get out of the vehicle. Now, I want to emphasize this part in the book. The Onion Field by Joseph Wamba is an incredible book. The movie's very well done, too. He wrote the screenplay for it. But I want to emphasize this quote in the book because it's an important part of the confusion that happened that night and in the looming days that followed. And the quote is, "Then a hand picked up Ian Campbell's Smith & Wesson, which was in the seat between them." And that's important, and we'll get to that a little bit later in this episode. So Powell then tells Ian to get out of the vehicle. Powell was standing between the passenger side door. Jimmy was at the rear of the vehicle. Ian steps out on the driver's side with his hands up and facing Jimmy at this point. And Ian, of course, is on the driver's side of the vehicle. So this leaves Officer Hettinger inside of the car, still cramped in the back seat. Greg Powell orders Hettinger to get out of the car. And Officer Hettinger says, "Can I use my hands, or how do you want me to do this? Just crawl over?" He said, "Yeah, crawl over." So Officer Hettinger uses his elbows to essentially crawl out of the vehicle. And this put Officer Hettinger standing there next to Officer Campbell on the driver's side of the vehicle. Carl is standing to the left of Ian. Now at the rear of the vehicle, both officers can see the silhouettes of Jimmy Lee Smith and Gregory Powell, and they can see that Powell is holding a weapon. And Powell walks over to Jimmy Smith and whispers something to him, and I don't think it was ever deciphered or figured out what it was that Powell whispered to Smith. Powell then walks over to the two officers, particularly in front of Officer Hettinger, but is looking right at Officer Campbell and asks him, "Have you ever heard of the Little Lindbergh Law?" In which Officer Campbell answers yes. Then Gregory Powell raises the gun and shoots Officer Campbell in the mouth, right above the top lip. Officer Campbell falls to the ground on his back. So at this point, Officer Hettinger is screaming in terror, and he begins to run off. And during this time that he ran off, 4 more shots are put into Officer Campbell, who was already on the ground. This is where there's some confusion, because neither Greg Powell or Jimmy Lee Smith admitted to shooting the 4 shots into Officer Campbell. Both of them blamed each other. Now, in the movie, directed by Harold Becker, the way they shot that conveyed the confusion as to what happened. It was a good way that they shot that. You can see Officer Hettinger, played by John Savage, running towards camera, and James Woods, who plays Gregory Powell, is standing next to Franklin Seals, who plays Jimmy Lee Smith, and they're standing over Ian Campbell, who's played by Ted Danson. Now, in Jimmy Lee Smith's right hand is a gun, and in Gregory Powell's left hand is a gun, and both of their arms are kind of really close, overlapping each other, both pointing down to Ian Campbell, and then shots are fired. So you really can't tell who was pulling the trigger in that shot. So I thought that was done well to convey that confusion. Now, Officer Hettinger was zigzagging and running away as Gregory Powell was firing shots at him, trying to find him. Hettinger runs to the left to a barbed wire fence and leaps over it. There's barbed wire and tumbleweed. He cuts himself, rips his pants, and ends up able to hide momentarily amongst the tumbleweed and the darkness. And at this point, he's thinking, instead of running north to the highway, which is what Powell and Smith figured he would do, he ended up coming back around south, back towards Officer Campbell's body. Gregory Powell, after throwing a few more shots, runs back to the car, yells at Jimmy Smith, asking him what the hell's the matter with you. This guy's getting away. He grabs Hettinger's flashlight and heads back to the field there just to shine some light to see if maybe he can find Hettinger. Officer Hettinger is still lying there, hiding out. Does look at his watch, and it's 12:15 a.m. at this point. Then Greg Powell heads back to the car, gets inside, and starts to reload whatever guns were fired. He leaves the .38 with Smith, and then Powell takes the automatic and Carl's flashlight with him back on foot, back up the road looking for Hettinger. So Jimmy Smith suggests that he takes the car, goes and looks for Hettinger, while Greg Powell is on foot, and then he'll come back around for him to pick him up. Greg Powell agrees, and Jimmy Smith takes off. Meanwhile, Officer Hettinger is headed south, then west, then north. He's kind of zigzagging in the field, just trying to lose these guys. He's tired. It's dark. He doesn't know the terrain. His partner's been killed. It's very, very chaotic. So as Officer Hettinger is racing across these fields as fast as he can, he comes across a farmhand on a tractor, what they call a cat, a man by the name of Emmanuel McFadden. Mr. McFadden helps Officer Hettinger. He allows him to get on the cat, and they take it for a little bit anyway, but once they find out it's too slow to gain any ground, they jump off of it, because in the distance they can see the flashlights moving, headlights moving, headed their way. So they continue on foot, and at one point Mr. McFadden looks back to where the cat is still running, and he sees a flashlight moving next to where the tractor's parked. Emmanuel McFadden was extremely scared He didn't know what the heck was going on. This guy just comes running up to him saying he's been shot at and his partner's been killed. So there was a point where Mr. McFadden separates himself from Officer Hettinger and just pretty much wants to lose him because he doesn't want any of these problems. But he changed his mind and waited for him. So now the two of them were heading towards a house at Mettler Ranch. But as they got a little closer, Emmanuel McFadden thought twice about it and said, well, whoever's chasing us can get to this house quicker than us. So maybe they're there waiting for us. So they changed direction. They continued west, keeping an eye on the lights in the distance, and they made it to a house at Opal Fry Ranch. Knocked on the door. A gentleman by the name of Jack Fry answers the door, and at the house was Mr. Fry's wife and their teenage son. Hettinger gets to go in, and that's where the call's made for help. And then a slight knock on the door is heard. A few minutes later, the door is opened, and Mr. Fry has a shotgun aimed at Emmanuel McFadden. And then once they figured out who he was, Mr. McFadden was allowed to come in, and they called for help. Back to Greg Powell, who was still alone on foot. He goes back to the coupe, back to Officer Campbell's body, and then rolls Officer Campbell into a ditch. And Officer Campbell landed face down, left arm up, and it seemed as if he was looking at his watch. In the movie, Powell goes back to Ian's body earlier than he did in the movie and rolls the body into the ditch. And also in the movie, the ditch wasn't in front of the car, where in the book, the ditch headed east and west, and that's what stopped the car. Jimmy Smith decided to just leave Gregory Powell in the field, desert him. He didn't want any other parts of this. And Greg Powell figured this out pretty quick. So it was about 12:40 a.m. at this point where Gregory Powell realized that Jimmy Smith wasn't coming back for him. So Powell goes and steals a car from the Riddick family. Now, the Riddick family lived in a neighborhood in the Clifford Mettler Ranch area. He stole the car and headed back to the Hideaway, which was the hotel they were staying at already. Now, Jimmy Smith had a decision to make. He had the vehicle, but does he head back to L.A., where they're probably really looking for him at this point, or does he continue up towards the Frisco area? The gas gauge was extremely low in the car Smith was in, so he pulls off in this town called Lamont in a parking area, leaves the car there and continues on foot throughout the night and ends up in a rooming house called Mom's Rooming House to spend the night. He checks in, no problem. So Greg Powell, now that he has a stolen vehicle, heads to the hideout, which was the Highway Motel where they were already staying, and he wants to switch cars because they have the station wagon parked there. So he gets inside his room, begins to shave his head, begins to switch cars, and then realizes that the keys to the station wagon are in his girlfriend Maxine's purse, who's in LA. So now he's frantic. So he finds a coin, I believe it was a dime, to switch plates from the station wagon that they drove up to Bakersfield with the stolen vehicle and drive out of there with the stolen vehicle and different plates. And at this time, the stolen vehicle from the Riddick household was called in, and police knew, based on the call from Officer Hettinger, what was going on, more or less. So they were on the lookout for two men in a stolen red and white Plymouth. Greg Powell was eventually pulled over by Officers Christ and Odom, and they quickly found out that that wasn't his vehicle, that the plates didn't match, the registration didn't match, and they arrested him. Now, Jimmy Smith, who made his way to Mom's rooming house, checked in okay and used the community bathroom, but it wasn't within 5 to 10 minutes that he was there that police came breaking down the door and detained him. So I wanted to get into what happened just before that night, March 9th. So in regards to the 1946 maroon Ford coupe, there's somewhat of a story on how they got to get that car. Initially, it was Gregory Powell, his girlfriend Maxine, and Jimmy Smith. They drove up to Boulder City in a station wagon. Gregory Powell knew a guy out there in Boulder City that was selling a car, that particular car. And they drove up there, they bought it from him, and they left at 2 in the morning. to head to San Francisco. And they stopped in Bakersfield at the Highway Motel and spent the night there. And in the middle of the night, Jimmy Smith hopped into the car, was going to take off in it, in the coupe. And Gregory Powell caught him outside, and Jimmy Smith talked his way out of it. So the initial plan was to go to Frisco and see what they can do up there, what robberies they can hit, whatever they can do up there. But Greg Powell changed the plan and said, hey, Jimmy, we're going to head back down to L.A. And, Jimmy Smith didn't like that plan. He didn't like the way Greg Powell was changing things. He just didn't like his whole M.O. So at first, it was Greg Powell and Maxine in the station wagon, and Jimmy Smith was driving the coupe, headed back to L.A. They switched up. They even passed the area off of Maricopa Highway that they were going to soon return to later that night. So once they got back to L.A., they dropped Maxine off and were cruising Hollywood, cruising for another liquor store to hold up or any kind of petty theft. And that's how they got caught up on Carlos Avenue. I encourage you to read the book and to watch the film. There's a lot of information, a lot of layers before and after the crimes involving Officer Ian Campbell and Officer Carl Hedinger. They have stories to them, and it puts things more in perspective. After this happened, Officer Carl Hedinger dealt with what's called PTSD and survivor's guilt. On September 4th, 1963, Jimmy Smith was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, which got changed to life in prison. He was eventually paroled out a few times and always made his way back to prison. He ended up dying in prison. He died at the age of 76 of a heart attack. On September 4th, 1963, Gregory Powell was convicted of kidnapping Officer Campbell and Officer Hedinger and murdering Officer Campbell. He was sentenced to death in November of that same year, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison, and he ended up dying in 2012 of prostate cancer. Officer Carl Hedinger died May 4th, 1994, of liver failure. He was cremated. Officer Ian Campbell is buried at Forest Lawn in Glendale. So definitely a very tragic killing of Officer Ian Campbell, and tragic as well as what this killing did to the life of his partner, Officer Carl Hedinger, the emotional toll it took upon him and his family. So I want to thank you all for joining me again on another true crime episode of 2S The Horror Quarters podcast. This one here is another Ghosts of LA edition. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one. Okay, I wanted to bring in Dan Wells. Dan Wells has been a police officer for 22 years in the Bakersfield area, and I wanted to kind of speak to him about this case and what he had heard about it, especially coming up in that area. Dan, any kind of insight into the case when you were in the academy or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I had heard about before. I knew about the Onion Field murder in the movie prior to ever going to the academy. But when I went to the academy in 2000, it is something that they bring up to us as a training tool. The incident, how it occurred, how it happened, and what better things can be done to make corrections so that something like that doesn't happen again.
Okay, so they pulled him over, and they were actually on Carlos heading eastbound. That when they pulled him over, they made a right onto Gower and pulled over there on the southwest corner. And hearing about this now, when you think like, damn, this is how they approached the car. Officer Campbell, who was driving his vehicle, it was unmarked, and he got out with a flashlight, as did Hedinger. I don't know how the procedures now, how that would work. They got out with a flashlight. Officer Campbell walks up to the driver's side and talks to Gregory Powell. A couple of questions. Hey, what are you doing? On the other side is Jimmy Lee Smith. Now, Jimmy Lee Smith gets out of the vehicle on his own, which is no bueno these days, but he gets out, puts his hands up. Hey, man, we're good, Now, on the other side of the car, the driver's side of the car, Officer Campbell asked Powell to get out. And Powell, noticing that all he had was a flashlight on him, Powell turns to his right and reverses his body towards the street to get out. And in doing so, grabs his weapon, which was tucked in his coat, turns around and got it right on Officer Campbell, turns Campbell around, puts the gun to Campbell's back, walks him over to Officer Hedinger. Nowadays, that probably wouldn't be procedure, right? With just flashlights, or am I wrong?
No, you're looking at a major difference between 1963 and 2022.
Okay.
Obviously, a lot of advancements in law enforcement, especially in the field of training. It's situations like this that we use for training to figure out the best tactics for approaching a vehicle, to approaching a suspect. And I said, these are the kind of things we'll talk about over and over. In this case, will be talked about forever in law enforcement, and the mistakes that were made and how things can be done better.
Okay. Was there a particular cloud that this case kind of weighs over Bakersfield? I mean, to this day?
The story weighs over Bakersfield simply because the murder actually happened up closer to here. They were brought here, so it's something that's known around here. I mean, it didn't really have much ties for Bakersfield other than the fact that they drove here.
Right.
But because it occurred closer to here, that we do hear about it.
Okay. And I know that they kind of said the same thing to Officer Hedinger when they wrote that memorandum saying, don't ever give your weapon up, and, talk to roll call for us, tell them about the mistakes you made. And I don't know that he made any mistakes. Like, again, it's not for me to pass judgment. I don't know what I would have done, but based on your experience, were there any mistakes made? What can you say about that?
Well, there were obviously mistakes made. I mean, 2 officers were kidnapped and 1 was murdered. So, yeah, there were obviously mistakes made. But it happened. It was a bad situation. As far as him giving up his gun, that training will never change. Officers will always be trained, do not give up your weapon, never give up your weapon.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, that's common training. That'll never change. Whether or not he should have at the time, I mean, I would only leave up to him. Okay. He made that decision. His partner told him to make that decision. His partner was in fear for his own life and told him to. Now, like I said, it's training never to do that, and most officers will continue to tell you that. They'll always tell you that, but until you're standing in his shoes in that situation, it's always going to be a guessing game and a judgment call.
Yeah, I mean, around that specific time, too, there were 3 cases, I believe all in L.A., where an officer had to give his weapon up. And in all 3 cases, the officer and officers involved ended up okay. So at the time, maybe that was in the back of their mind, like, okay, well, we're going to be okay based on the 3 previous ones. Again, a gun to your partner's back and the guy's saying, hey, man, give up your weapon. I don't know what else there would be to do.
I think the most pressing issue would probably be the fact that his partner himself, who was in trouble, told him to give up his weapon. If there was anything that swayed his decision making, I would have to say that was it. When your partner, who is depending on you at the moment, tells you to give up your weapon, no officer or very few officers would give up their weapon in other situations. But in that situation, his partner was telling him to give it up, and his partner was the one in trouble. So he made a decision based on probably at that moment the well-being of his partner.
Now, they say it happened near Bakersfield, but I'm calling it Bakersfield because even the address there at the Opal Fry Ranch is Bakersfield. They took him up there with the intent. Mostly, this is all on Powell. I mean, obviously, it's on Smith as well too, but Powell was the main driver in all this. As far as what his plans were. And his plans, even though he told the officers that he's going to let them go in the field there, his plan was to kill him. He shot Officer Campbell, and Officer Hettinger took off running. I mean, what else is he supposed to do? You got two men who have all four guns.
Had Hettinger not ran, he'd have been dead too. I mean, That was the intention. They were going to kill him right there. He ran. It was already too late for his partner. He ran. He survived. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to second guess him on that either. I've never been in that situation, but he did what he had to do, and he got out of there, and he survived, and he's very lucky he did. And we spoke about this a little earlier. It happened on a Saturday night. Officer Hettinger went back to work Monday. That wouldn't happen now, right? Oh, absolutely not. Incident like this happened, I would say probably lucky if he ever went back to work, but he would definitely be off for a while. Yeah. Getting over this situation or coming to grips with what happened. Yeah, he dealt with a lot of PTSD and survivor's guilt over the years. Yeah, 1963 PTSD wasn't something they worried about too much. You got in a shooting, you got involved in an incident, you went right back to work. Precisely. Yeah. And it drove him into a depression. He started to shoplift blatantly, just in front of people. And the idea behind that, at least the thought process that I've read, is his guilt. He just wanted to be caught for something, and it was traumatic what happened to him, but he kind of recouped. He became a gardener. And after that, he ended up getting elected for Kern County supervisor, went into politics, and unfortunately passed away in 1994. But to me, they're both American heroes, considering what they went through that night. And I wanted to bring you in just because, you're up there, you work up there, you went there for me and checked out the layout of the land, which I appreciate too. Oh, no problem. I'd love to be involved in anything like this. I mean, it's a bad situation. Nobody wants to relive it, but right. Something to happen. And like I said, we'll talk about it. Law enforcement will talk about this forever just because of the training aspects of it. Okay. Well, hey, Dan, I appreciate the time, brother. Thank you, Mike. And we'll chat soon, all right? All right. Have a good one. Okay, welcome back to 2S, the Horror Quarters podcast. Today's episode will be covering the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which occurred on November 22nd of 1963. There's a little bit of history for me in regards to that case. Back in 92, which was my senior year of high school, I had to do a term paper on a subject, and I didn't know what to do it on, and I remember the teacher reading off a list, and one of the choices was the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I chose that one because that was just the one, like the last one I heard him say, and I just wanted to get the term paper over with. Well, that created somewhat of a monster in me in regards to true crime. That was my first true crime or American crime story that I became extremely engulfed in and obsessed with that year. And coincidentally, one of my elective classes, I worked in the school library. So
And John F. Kennedy's assassination was one of the subjects that had quite a few books in that library that I was able to go over while I was there, and also able to check out and take home and study. And, it became, like I said, somewhat of an obsession. And I'm trying to show my friends the books, and they just want to hang out. It's our senior year in high school, and I'm bringing these books with me to try to show them, like, hey, check this out. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And the majority of the books back then were conspiracy books, conspiracy theory related books in regards to the assassination. I even wrote a small paragraph that made it into the newspaper, the local newspaper at the time. Basically said I believe the headshot came from the grassy knoll. So, we'll get into all of that. I know there are countless theories. I'm not going to push any theory upon anyone. So fast forward to 1994. My Uncle Gerald, who I used to call Theo Turkey, he was working in Dallas. He was a consultant for some of the banks out there. And he flew me out there that year, and I was able to spend a couple of days checking out Dealey Plaza. I took a little tour out there. It wasn't that in-depth of a trip as far as what I could take photos of. But anyways, it was still a very good trip for me to actually see things that I've only read about. And Theo Turkey, who has since passed away, is the reason I named this podcast 2S. He passed away in 2018, and when we went to New York to clean out his apartment in Queens, I had just started this podcast, but I didn't have a name for it. So I was struggling to find a name for it, and I knew that something like that would have to come to me. So as we're cleaning his apartment, I'm taking a break in the hallway there, and I'm leaned up against the wall right across from his door to his apartment. And I'm looking right at his door buzzer, and around the peephole is the label for his apartment number, which was 2S. So what you see on the logo is 2S, and that is his actual door buzzer. The eyeball inside of the slider there is actually my son's eye mixed in with some type of zombie or something like that. So over the years, as I moved on from the J.F.K. assassination, I started to study other true crime cases, some that I've covered on this very podcast. So we come to 2013, which was the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Myself and a friend flew back to Dallas to be there for that, to see what that was like 50 years later. And that was extremely interesting because that time I got to go up to the 6th floor into the museum and see what that was like, and had a much more solid understanding of the events during that time. But one of the drawbacks for the 2013 visit was I didn't really run video. I took a bunch of still photos, but at the time I didn't know I was going to be doing this, so we had to go back, and we just came back a couple of days ago. Myself, my co-producer Ralfa, and Jose, we went and covered a lot of things, took a lot of video, so you'll be seeing that in this episode. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy and his wife Jackie were staying at the Hotel Texas, and it was outside of the Hotel Texas that he gave a speech to a large crowd. Here is the Hilton Fort Worth, and back then it was called the Hotel Texas, but this is located at 815 Main Street in Fort Worth. And this building here is where his final speech was given, inside of the Crystal Ballroom over breakfast. He did give a speech outside in the light rain to a crowd, and if anyone doesn't know, this kid here, this 8-year-old boy on the shoulders of his dad, is the late actor Bill Paxton. Bill Paxton, of course, starred in Aliens, Titanic. He executive produced Parkland. Here is the dedication to John F. Kennedy and his speech outside. This is the general area that he gave the speech. I don't know that it's the exact area based on the logistics of what it looks like now. But here is a bronze statue, and it's a beautiful, beautiful statue. The president and Jackie stayed on the 8th floor, which was then room 850. I've read that room 808 is the only part left of that room, but I've also read that rooms 806, 808, and 810 were part of that room. And from there, the motorcade went from Love Field into Dallas and into Dealey Plaza. From Hotel Texas to Carswell Air Force Base, it shows it at 7.2 miles away, but if you take the routes and the roads and stuff, it's about 10 miles. So here's an overview of the distance from Carswell Air Force Base to Love Field, and it shows it at about 35 miles away. So heading west on Main Street, the motorcade makes a right onto Houston, heading north, heading towards the Texas School Book Depository, where it then makes a slow left around that curve onto Elm Street. And somewhere just past the streetlight would be where the first shot was fired. And then as President Kennedy emerges from behind the Stemmons freeway sign, he's clearly clutching his throat. He's been hit. And of course, pretty much lined up to where Mr. Zapruder was filming, the headshot landed, jolting the president's head back into the left. The Warren Commission came up with what was called the single bullet theory, or the magic bullet theory, where one bullet was responsible for 7 wounds. And the bullet itself, allegedly found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital, has been described as pristine. I think if you look a little deeper into it, it does have a little bit of damage to it, but it definitely, in my uneducated opinion regarding firearms and bullets, it's not what I would have expected on a bullet causing 7 wounds. And the 7 wounds being entering the back of President Kennedy's neck, exiting the front of his neck, entering Governor Connolly's back, shattering one of his ribs, exiting Governor Connolly's chest, striking Governor Connolly's right wrist, and then embedding into Governor Connolly's left thigh. We couldn't put our drone up when we went last month because it was just way too windy. I started scouring the internet, reaching out to people, and Justin was kind enough to respond. Justin, I appreciate you coming through for me here. Anyone that needs any kind of drone photography, please visit Wonder Drone Photography and reach out to Justin. Thanks again, Justin. So here we are, up high over Dealey Plaza, and you can see here there's Main Street, and then if you make the right onto Houston, you'll approach the Texas School Book Depository, make that left onto Elm, and head down Elm. And right about here and here is where we know shots landed. And right about here is where the headshot hit. And after the shots, this here is where the president's motorcade sped through the triple underpass and headed to Parkland.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The president's body was then taken to Love Field Airport and placed upon Air Force One, where then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as new president.
I saw the president grab at his throat, and he moved to his left violently, and I knew something was wrong. And so I jumped from the follow-up car, ran toward the presidential vehicle with the idea of getting on top of the rear of the car to form a protective barrier behind President and Mrs. Kennedy to prevent any further damage from being done. As I got close to the car, a third shot was fired, and it hit the president in the head. It entered the rear of the president's head, and it exited the upper right quadrant of the skull. And blood and brain matter and bone fragments came out of the wound, came over the back of the car, over Mrs. Kennedy, and onto myself. While I was doing that, Mrs. Kennedy came out in the trunk. She was trying to grab some of the material that came off the president's head. She's right up on the back of the car. And she didn't know I was there. And I finally got up there and I got a hold of her and put her in the back seat. And when I did that, the president's body fell to its left into her lap. His head was on her lap, and the right side of his face was up. I could see his eyes were fixed, and I considered it a fatal wound.
Here we are back at Dealey Plaza on the ground. Footage shot by Jose Gomez for Positive Negative Photography. George Dealey was a Dallas, Texas businessman, and he was a longtime publisher of the Dallas Morning News and owner of the A.H. Bello Corporation. The plaza was named in his honor in 1934. And of course, the plaza has gained notoriety. In my opinion, this is the most infamous crime scene in American history. Even more famous and prominent than the O.J. Simpson case, the Patty Hearst case, and several other cases. But to me, this is the king of crime scenes for a couple of reasons. The first reason would be we've all seen the Zapruder film, so the crime itself has been documented. And the second reason that it is so prominent and the king of all crime scenes is that it has all been preserved to relatively close to how it looked back then in 1963. And on top of that, it is accessible to the public. Here, Jose is standing on the Zapruder pillar where Abraham Zapruder shot the infamous 8mm footage of the assassination. There's some trees overgrown here, so we couldn't get the exact level, but it's close. So as you can see from where Jose is standing and shooting this, Abraham was really close to the shooting, and he kept the fortitude up to keep rolling to catch the headshot amidst all the chaos. Here we are behind the wooden fence up on the grassy knoll where a lot of people think the headshot came from. And while you're back here, you can see how hidden it is, yet it's extremely close and it's almost a perfect shot if that's where the shot was taken. And of course, there were several witnesses pointing up to the grassy knoll right after the shots. And a lot of people started running up that knoll thinking some of the shots were coming from there. Now, it's to be noted that Dealey Plaza has been described by some as comparable to a canyon where sound can bounce around and travel around and sound like it's coming from one spot when it's coming from another spot, just because of the way the buildings enclose the area and the gaps in the buildings as well.
After 11 or 11:30, there was practically no movement in the area whatsoever. However, about 12:10, give or take 5 minutes, there was a car which entered the area and probed around for some time. This car was a 59 Oldsmobile station wagon with a out-of-state license. It was muddy as if it had just come in off of the road from some area where it was a red sandy area. It was occupied by one male who spent 3 or 4 minutes in the area looking it over, and then, as he found out, left by the entrance, which is the only way in and out of the area at that time. Not too long after that, perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, a car of a totally different description, also occupied by one male, entered the area. Now, this man performed a similar action, and he toured down around the area, probing to examine the exits, and seemed at one or more occasions to have a mic or something resembling such an instrument up to his face. Just a few moments after that, the third car came into the area, and these were the only 3 cars that entered this area during this specific period. The third car was a 61 or 2 Chevrolet. This car was muddy all the way up to the windows as if it had just come in off the road. It had an out-of-state license identical to the first car of the series. And it also had political stickers on it, which were not only for the same candidate, but were identical in nature and color, so that they appeared to have been from the same group. This car was occupied by one male who spent a little bit more time in the area than the others, and probed down by the side of the tower where I was located. I could not state that these cars left the area entirely, because after they got back onto the extension of Elm Street in front of the school depository building, they were lost to my vision, so that they could have remained very close by. Immediately after the shots were fired, of course, was mass confusion, to put it mildly. But the area was immediately sealed off by, I would say, at least 50 police within 3 to 5 minutes. At the time of the shooting, in the vicinity of where the 2 men I've described were, there was a flash of light, or there was something which occurred which caught my eye in this immediate area on the embankment. Now, what this was, I could not state at that time, and at this time I could not identify it, other than there was some unusual occurrence, a flash of light or smoke or something which caused me to feel like something out of the ordinary had occurred there.
In front of us coming towards us, and we heard the first shot, and the president, I don't know who was hit first, but the president jumped up in his seat. And then as the car got directly in front of us, well, a gunshot apparently from behind us hit the president inside of the temple.
Do you think the first gunshot came from behind you too?
I think it came from the same location. Apparently back up on the mall, I don't know what you call it.
You should think the shot came from up on top of the viaduct toward the president. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Not on the viaduct itself, but up on top of the hill, a little mound of ground there, the garden.
Oh, I thought it was a firecracker, and I saw the blood, and I had the baby, and I just ran, and I got on top of him and laid on the grass. And kind of raised up in his seat, and I thought, he was kind of going along with a gag or something.
We are down here at the triple underpass where a bystander by the name of James Tague was hit by fragments of one of the bullets, which, logically speaking, would account for one shot. James Tague was standing right about in this area where he was struck. And if you believe that James Tague was hit by fragments of one of the bullets, then that leaves you with 2 bullets left.
Well, that furthest street over is a one-way going that way. And I was in this lane closest to us, right over there. That car just popped, those cars just came through. If you come over to that first column between the streets, I was standing right out from it. Right. My car was still parked underneath until what it passed. You turn around, one down, and the last one over is a 6th floor window. And he looked up at me and he says, "You got blood on your face." And I reached up and I remembered it's something that stung me during the shooting.
Right here, we're walking north on Houston and looking at what was then the Texas School Book Depository. And at the 6th floor window there, they have a display up, but that was the window that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly fired the 3 shots from. There are so many theories out there, it's just a matter of what you believe in, but that is the 6th floor window there, and that is where Lee Harvey Oswald was employed at the time. We were able to catch this tour guide here. Shout out to you, whoever you are. But he made the left from Houston onto Elm into that center lane in somewhat of a replica of the vehicle that the president was in. And you can see him heading down Elm Street there. Approaching the first X on the street where the first shot entered the back of John F. Kennedy's neck. One of the key witnesses that, by choice, stayed out of the limelight was a 15-year-old kid by the name of Amos Ewings. Amos was standing at a pillar right across the street from the Texas School Book Depository, so he had an up-front and close view of the president's limousine making that left onto Elm, and he was pretty much lined up with the 6th floor window at the Texas School Book Depository. And he was at a prime spot here, because just in front of him, looking up 6 stories, was the 6th floor window that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly fired the shots from. And according to Amos, he saw a rifle from that window and a man there. And he pointed the officers in his area to the depository. And that's where they went up and searched to see what was going on, where they found the rifle, the shells, so forth. If you haven't been to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, I definitely recommend it. The floor now is a museum filled with different pieces of information on the walls, different facts about the case and photos. Very interesting. There are 2 sections of the floor that are glassed off, and one is Oswald's alleged perch. The 6th floor window, you can see pretty much how he had it. I don't think it's original boxes or anything like that, but it's original flooring, original walls. And with that, you can get an idea of how it looked that day. On the other side of the building, in the other corner, is where they found the rifle and a clipboard. That is also glassed off. You can see a couple of freight elevators that look as they did back then, which is another interesting aspect of the building. You can take photos there, but not flash photography, and you cannot take any video. But you can go to the 7th floor and go right over the 6th floor perch and stand directly over the 6th floor sniper's nest and get some pictures outside of that window. And you can see how far it is, the distance it is down into the grassy knoll. And you can see where the X's are marked in the street there, what the shooter would have seen. This is Lee Harvey Oswald's wedding ring that he left in a cup on the dresser at Marina's bedside on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. This is the letter Z from the famous Hurt sign that was on the roof of the Texas School Book Depository. This is very interesting here. This is the hat that Jack Ruby wore when he gunned down Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement there. This is the tan suit worn by Detective James Lavelle, who was escorting Lee Harvey Oswald from police headquarters to the county jail. This model was built so that investigators could get a better visual on the grounds of Dealey Plaza and the potential trajectory of the bullets. I do want to say one of the museum curators there, Stephen Fagan, I talked to him in 2013 and he told me in regards to the Zapruder film, I asked him, what do you think about the Zapruder film? And he said one thing about the Zapruder film is that it'll tell you whatever you want it to tell you. And he's right. Depending on what you believe, the Zapruder film will somehow back it up. Now, less than an hour earlier, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested at a Texas movie theater on Jefferson Street. On Sunday morning, November 24th, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot and killed on live television by Jack Ruby. Oswald himself then died 2 hours later at Parkland Hospital. Here we are at the Texas Theater, which has been renovated over the years, and as you can see, it's kept up pretty well. The outdoor box office is the box office that Oswald walked right past and through this area here of these two doors. I'm sure these aren't the original doors, but it was on the right side here that Oswald walked into. Now the box office is on the inside. Shout out to the Scream franchise as well. We weren't able to get into the interior of the theater, so I want to thank Dan Restadon, Object History, and That Don Lewis for the use of their footage of the inside of the theater. Oswald's actual seat is long gone, but this is where it would be right here. 3rd row down, 5th seat over. Here is where Lee Harvey Oswald is buried. It's the Shannon Rose Hill Funeral Chapel and Cemetery in Fort Worth. And next to Oswald's grave is kind of another famous grave. I don't know the real story on it. I heard a couple of things here and there, but Nick Beef. We also went to visit 214 Neely Street, which the structure is still there. It's vacant, but it's still there. According to one of the neighbors there, who was extremely friendly to us and helpful, he just recommended that we take as many pictures as we can because they are going to tear it down. This is the location that Oswald took the famous photo where he's holding the rifle in one hand and the paper in the other. And it pretty much still looks the same. There's another theory that was presented in 2011. A man by the name of Max Holland and his team of investigators named it the Lost Bullet. And what Max Holland is saying is that the first bullet hit the street light just above the limousine as it crossed onto Elm Street. Max Holland and his team came across this Secret Service training film, which was shot on November 27th, 5 days after the assassination. And it looks to me like a recreation of what happened. And what he found on this footage was on one side of this traffic light, you can see a white blemish, probably a hole or some kind of marking on the street light. And if you were to go to the other side of that street light, that white indentation or mark matches up. This shows evidence of the first shot deflecting off of that light, missing the president altogether, where it traveled down the street and eventually hit a curb, which eventually injured James Tague. And to piggyback on that theory, Max Holland covers this moment of the Zapruder film, which I find interesting because don't just look at the president or Governor Connolly or the president's vehicle. Look around and you can try to get a gauge on what the people around were reacting to. This Secret Service agent here is George Hickey. And George Hickey's statement reads as follows. After a short distance, I heard a loud report, which sounded like a firecracker. It seemed to come from the rear right, which seemed to me to be on the ground. I stood up and looked to my right and back, trying to recognize it. Apart from people yelling and cheering, nothing caught my attention. And you can see him here, clearly turning to his left, crouching down, looking to the ground. This is him here. And you can see the president still waving. This is consistent with the theory that the first shot missed and hit that traffic light where it eventually diverted down the street, struck the curb, and from the residue of that wounded James Tague. Now this video was taken by Robert Hughes. He catches the president heading north on Houston, making the left onto Elm. And on the Lost Bullet documentary, they really zoom in on the 6th floor window as the president's limo makes the left. As you can see here, the president making the left, we have a nice shot of the 6th floor window, grainy, but it still shows the 6th floor window. Now as we zoom in here, Max Holland claims you can see movement in that window, and that movement is Lee Harvey Oswald making his adjustments to fire off the 3 shots. Look closely. I see some kind of movement in that window in what appears to be a white t-shirt or a light colored t-shirt. At approximately 1:14 p.m., Officer J.D. Tippett stopped Lee Harvey Oswald, who was on foot near the intersection of 10th Street and Patton. As he got out of his vehicle, Lee Harvey Oswald shot him 4 times. and fled on foot to a local movie theater on Jefferson Boulevard. According to witnesses, as Officer Tippit exited his vehicle to approach Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald pulled out his revolver and shot him 3 times until he fell, and as Officer Tippit lay there, he was then shot a 4th time in the head, killing him. Going to the intersection where Officer J.D. Tippit was murdered was also an experience that was pretty memorable, because that's another tragic story. Officer Tippit, according to his wife Marie, came home that day and surprised her and her son and had lunch with them, and then said he had to get back out there because, the president's in town. And Officer Tippit, as he approached Oswald, of course, was shot and killed right there in the street. There's an X there that shows the location where that happened. And when you're there, you really feel the sorrow. To me, that was the one location where it really hit home. I think because we already have so much information in regards to J.F.K. being assassinated, with Dealey Plaza and the 6th floor, autopsy photos, the Zapruder film, and all that. So we have a familiarity of that. In my opinion, the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit, we're not that intimate with. We're not that familiar with. We're not that close to as we are in relation to other things about the case. We've all seen Jack Ruby shooting Oswald on TV. We've all seen the Zapruder film. But there is no video of Officer Tippit being gunned down. All there is just a lonely intersection. There was someone there that helped us out, talked to us, that lived near there, a guy by the name of Jose. So I want to thank you for giving us a little bit more information in regards to what happened. He gave us the way Oswald came in and showed us and pointed us to how far it was from that house to Jefferson, where the movie theater was. So thank you, Jose, for that. Here's an aerial shot of the distance between the Tippit location to the movie theater on Jefferson Boulevard, and it's 0.63 miles. And here we are at 1026 North Beckley Avenue in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, and it is ran by a Patricia Puckett Hall, or as she says to call her, Pat. We went in there and we took the tour. Pat was incredibly hospitable, answered any questions that we had. This is where Lee Harvey Oswald stayed and rented that small room with the small bed that is still there. It's the original frame, but the mattress has since been disposed of. But Pat gave some history on the place, and I believe there were 18 rooms were rented out to various people at the time. But her memories of Lee, though she didn't live there, the place was ran by Pat's grandmother. Pat would be there with her brothers, and she's got stories about how kind and friendly Lee was, especially with the children, helping out. There was a story that Pat told her 2 brothers were fighting in the front yard, and by the time Pat got outside, Lee Harvey Oswald had the 2 boys separated and sorting out the situation and kind of making good on the fight. This trip was full of great and surreal experiences in regards to this case, and going to the Ruth Payne house where Marina and the kids lived was another highlight. The Ruth Payne house is located at 2515 West 5th Street in Irving, and it is well preserved. It's an operational museum now at this point that has certain hours during the week and times because it is a neighborhood. The front yard here is where Ruth Payne talked about on that Thursday. She came home from grocery shopping and she saw Lee outside with the kids playing, and she thought in her mind, well, what's he doing here? He's usually here on Fridays. So that was a little weird to her, but Lee helped her in with the groceries and ended up spending the night that Thursday night and leaving Friday morning with Mr. Frazier. So when we got there, it was just myself, Ralfa, and Jose, and one person who was there running the place. And we pretty much had free reign in the house. According to our tour guide, there were 2 pieces of furniture that were originally in the home, and I believe it was this lamp and this speaker that were donated by Ruth's husband, Michael. But it is an incredible place to visit and see because this is the house that Marina was staying at. She was split up with Lee, but they were still trying to work it out. So Lee would usually come here during that time on Fridays and then go back out to work on Monday to the Texas School Book Depository. Here is the garage, and this carpet here represents the carpet that Oswald hid his rifle in. He had it rolled up and tucked away in the garage somewhere in this area. Now heading down the street here to the corner lived Lenny Mae Randall. Now Lenny's brother, Wesley Buell Frazier, was staying with her at the time and was also a co-worker of Lee Harvey Oswald's at the School Book Depository. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Lenny said that she looked out the window here, I'm guessing it's this window here, and she saw Lee walking towards the house with a box in his hands that was about 2.5 feet tall, in which Lee said that they were curtain rods. Lee puts the curtain rods into the back of Mr. Frazier's vehicle, and the 2 of them head to the Texas School Book Depository. And as you can see here, it's a short walk from the Ruth Payne house to where Wesley Frazier was living, 250 feet. I was able to visit John F. Kennedy's Eternal Flame at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, but I wasn't able to get any kind of video that I wanted because there was probably 60 people, maybe even more, surrounding it. But I will include photos of it, photos that I was able to get. I had a neighbor back then who was around when the assassination occurred, so he saved some of these publications and newspapers and things and gave them to me. Here's just a few of them. This one here is interesting. He framed it. It's some type of error that was made, which states assassinate Kennedy. But he framed it, and he was nice enough to give me all of this stuff because he saw I was studying it at the time. So shout out to Wally. This was my 3rd trip out there, but it was definitely a necessity to bring Ralfa and Jose out there to get this footage so I can present it to you and you can see it more in real time. So I'm glad I went, and it probably won't be my last time out there. Again, thank you for joining me. Please like and subscribe and comment on whatever your thoughts are regarding this case, and we will see you on the next one. Okay, welcome back to 2S, the Horror Quarters podcast. I want to thank you for joining me again. It's been a while since I've done an episode. I've been extremely busy, but thank you for hanging in there with me. This particular episode covers the Dallas PD ambush shooting that took place July 7th, 2016, near the intersection of Lamar and Main Street in front of El Central College in Dallas, Texas. I had been down there to cover the J.F.K. case, and while I was there, because it is so close to where J.F.K. was assassinated in 1963, I wanted to also get the coverage of this. It's a very sensitive topic, a very sensitive subject. Just the year before, in 2015, a man by the name of James Bulware rolled up to Dallas Police Department headquarters and started firing a barrage of bullets into the building, into the glass doors and windows, and led police on a chase. I believe it was about 10 miles to the city of Hutchins. And this man was in a van that was loaded with firearms. It had gun slots on it. He led the police on a high-speed chase to the city of Hutchins and ended up in a parking lot of a Jack-in-the-Box. And police had to use a sniper to shoot a 50 cal round into the van's engine block to disable it, and then had to put another round into the suspect, killing him inside of the van. Now, the suspect got on the phone and told police he blames law enforcement for his son being taken away from him. Here is footage here of the van being detonated by the bomb squad. He told police that inside of the van there were explosives, so they sent in a robot and blew the van up. Here's a Google Earth image of Dealey Plaza and El Central College. You can see the proximity to each other in a straight line. It is roughly 1,300 feet or just over 1,300 feet in just about 3 blocks. Of course, this happened during a peaceful protest, and the individual who started firing upon police officers and with the crowd around was not part of this peaceful protest. This protest had to do with demonstrations to protest the shootings, the recent police shootings in a couple of other states. Again, I want to reiterate, the suspect was not part of this peaceful protest. An individual by the name of Micah Xavier Johnson parked his vehicle on Lamar Street on the east side, right in front of El Central College, left his flashers blinking, got out, and walked southbound on Lamar to Main Street. With a tan body armor vest of some sort, he opened fire at that intersection, the intersection being Lamar and Main Street. And in doing so, he killed Senior Corporal Lauren Ahrens, Officer Michael Kroll, and Officer Patricio Patrick Zamaripa. Injured in this general area were Senior Corporal Ivan Saldana, Officer Jorge Barrientos, Officer Gretchen Rocha, and civilian Shatamia Taylor. Johnson then turned around and headed northbound on Lamar, back towards where his vehicle was parked. Here is a Google Earth image of where the suspect parked his vehicle, which was right about here, and walked southbound towards the intersection there of Lamar and Main, and that's where he opened fire. Here is some of our footage, and you can see the demonstration was headed eastbound. And this is a closer shot of the intersection of Lamar and Main, where the suspect opened fire. He then turned around and headed northbound back towards where his vehicle was parked. And as he headed north, to his left were glass doors that would gain entrance into the college. He fired upon these glass doors, trying to get through that way. And in doing so, he wounded 2 El Central police officers who were inside of the building, just on the other side of the glass doors. Officer John Abbott and Corporal Brian Shaw were on the inside of those doors. Unable to get through, Johnson continued northbound. Here's the area here, the doors that the suspect fired into and shattered. At the time, he was trying to gain entrance into the building at this location. As Johnson continued northbound, he came across a DART officer by the name of Brent Thompson and began to engage gunfire. As Officer Brent Thompson took cover behind the pillar, the suspect fired to one side of the pillar and came around the other side of the pillar, coming up behind Officer Thompson and killing him. It was at this time that Officer John Abbott was able to exit El Centro College and try and help out Officer Brent Thompson, but of course it was too late at this point. Micah Johnson then made a left onto Elm Street, heading westbound, where he shot his way and gained entrance through doors on that side. Johnson rounded the corner here and headed towards the El Centro College archway, where he entered the building there by shooting through those doors. Once Johnson entered El Centro College, he began to leave a blood trail from his injuries. Heading up the stairway, Corporal Shaw was able to follow the suspect. Shaw was fired upon during this time but was not hit. Johnson then made his way up to the second floor and across a mezzanine to another part of the building, to the north side of the building.
Officer Hernandez and myself were near the Main Street entrance doors when we heard some gunfire. So then we took off. I called out on the radio and started heading to the Lamar Street because that's where I knew the area that it was at. We made it over to the Lamar Street entrance. Officer Abbott and myself, there's two sets of doors there. We made it through the first set, then we started receiving fire. I was shot on my left side, so we retreated. I went back with Officer Hernandez and Officer Pouncey to retrieve the tactical gear and the ARs. We went back to the Lamar Street side, and then that's when we noted there was gunfire on the Elm Street side. So we made our way to the Elm Street side, noticed a trail of blood going up to a stairwell. We made entry into the stairwell, received fire, and that's whenever we went and met up with DPD and then started checking the first floor of the building.
And we went through the Lamar Street door, immediately started taking fire. The glass door exploded in front of me. Then we, as you said, we pulled back to go get tactical gear. I recognized the rifle fire, held the door with Officer Mon. I made egress once. There was still firing going on. I pulled back in. Went out a second time, locked onto what turns out to be the subject vehicle. DPD at that point was still exchanging fire and told me to go back inside. I managed to get back in, held the door as Corporal was coming up. DPD was pushing forward. I joined in with those guys and noted an officer was down on the street or on the sidewalk about 20 feet up. Grabbed him, pulled him back out of line of fire. Turns out it was DART Officer Brent Thompson, who's a friend of mine. Tried to perform any medical aid I could on him at that point, but he was pretty much gone. We loaded him in a vehicle. He was evacuated from the scene. As we went around the corner, or getting ready to go around the corner to re-engage the fight, Corporal Shaw called on the radio, said he was inside the building. DPD and I then re-entered the building from Lamar Street, started securing the floors at that point.
From a window on the north side of the building, Johnson fired down onto Elm Street, striking and killing Sergeant Michael Smith just in front of the 7-Eleven convenience store. Here's a Google Earth image of where the 7-Eleven is. I don't know why this particular photo doesn't have the 7-Eleven sign. I do know when I went earlier this year, there was a 7-Eleven there. But nonetheless, you can see in relation to where El Centro College is, it's directly across the street. This photo here is presumably the window that the suspect fired out of down onto the street, down onto Sergeant Michael Smith. DART officer Jesus Reytana was struck in the tricep as well in that general area. At this point, many police officers en route inside of the building trying to catch the suspect. Micah Johnson ended up down a hallway that dead-ended into an alcove type of area where he was holed up. He was engaging in gunfire.
Damn it. That's fire 6-4 else. Stay right there. Come out with your hands up! Drop your weapon and come out! What's your name? Huh? X? Hey, X, how you doing? X, I need you to put that gun down and come out of here. Well, I know you're prepared for this. Obviously, this isn't going to end well.
This is Sergeant Larry Gordon, who was the SWAT negotiator for the Dallas Police Department at the time. And Sergeant Gordon was the one having communications with Johnson, pretty much yelling down a corridor back and forth at each other.
He was really upset about the shootings. I teach a lot of classes on de-escalation, so I knew the stats on the shootings when you break them down by race. And I told him that most people in this country that are shot are white males. He didn't believe me.
I think you have a valid point. But listen to me, X, can you hear me? I can't hear your point because I'm too worried about being shot.
He wanted all of us to transition tonight. And I said, what do you mean transition? He said, transition from this life to the next. So I'm thinking, oh, okay, he wants us to die. So I knew I had to get the emotionality down to get the rationality up.
If you are my brother, put your weapon on both sides. You know what? Nah. Play the long game. Play the long game. Stay on your team. About a year later, when you're out of here, kill them all. Kill them all at the funeral. Kill them all at the wake.
At approximately 1:30 a.m., a remote control robot was sent in, loaded with C4. The robot was detonated and Johnson was killed. There were 2 handguns and what has been described as an AK-74 next to the suspect's body. Because of the amount of gunfire, initially it was thought that it was more than one shooter. A couple of suspects were arrested and released, and based on the investigation, it was a lone shooter. Here is Shatamia Taylor talking about what happened to her that night.
It was a pause and there was a second shot, and the police officer, I saw him, kind of tall, hefty, white guy, bald. I remember seeing him, and that second shot, he kind of, as he was going down, he said he has a gun, run. I'm sorry. He said he has a gun. He has a gun, run. And my kids started running. And I wanted to make sure that they were all in front of me, so they started running up the block. And I was running behind them. And I felt the bullet. I don't know if it bounced off the ground or what, but I felt it when it hit me in the back of my leg. And my son, Andrew, I turned around to grab me. Because I guess he turned around to see where I was and he went to grab me, but I had already been shot. So I tackled him and pushed him into the street. And I think he hit the car and we ended up in between the car and the curb. And I just laid on top of him. And police officers had started coming up the block. And one of them, I heard him when he said, "Is anybody hit?" My son said no, because he didn't know I was shot. And I was saying yes, but I wasn't saying it loud enough so my son could hear me, because I didn't want him to hear me. And the officer said it again kind of loud, and I said, yes, sir, I'm hitting my leg. And the other officer jumped on top of me and covered me and my son. And there was another one at our feet, and there was another one over our head. And there was several of them lined against the wall over there, and they stayed there with us. And I saw another officer. Saw another officer get shot right there in front of me again. That was two.
I want to thank you for joining me again on another True Crime episode, and we will see you on the next one.
So I wanted to bring in active police officer Dan Wells and retired police officer Sean Battle to get their thoughts on the Dallas PD ambush shooting. How you guys doing today?
Doing good.
Doing good. How you doing?
I'm all right. So I went there to the actual site of the shooting, which occurred on July 7, 2016. And about 3 blocks from where J.F.K. was assassinated. It's pretty close. Sean, you were there within the last couple of years, right?
Correct. I actually went there. I went there to see the J.F.K. thing. My daughter was actually in town playing basketball for a travel ball team. So I decided to take a trip. And I ended up stumbling on that scene. Actually, it was the second or third anniversary of the actual shooting when I was there. But like I said, I happened to be there because I wanted to go see the JFK thing. And like you said, it was about 3 blocks away.
Yeah, it's like, I think like 1,300 feet or something in a straight line. So when you got there, what kind of first hit you? And what were your thoughts just looking around at the buildings and the layout based on what you saw, the footage and everything?
Of course, being a retired officer, you know, it brought a little bit of uneasiness to me. I was amazed at how close it was to that scene. First of all, to the JFK scene.
Yeah,
and just seeing where there were so many people in the street, there were so many different things going on, and then to know that these officers were gunned down right there was kind of surreal.
Yeah, exactly. And then so did you kind of envision, if you were there, how difficult it would be, just because of, it's almost like a canyon. I know Dealey Plaza is described as a canyon where everything echoes. You really don't know where
it's coming from.
Yeah. Yep.
If anybody watched that footage, you would see so many people out there. And it's pretty much in the downtown area. And the way the buildings are structured, I'm sure the shots would echo from this building to that building, back to that building, and you have no idea where those shots are coming from.
Right.
You also have a tremendous amount of people out there with so many things going on, emotions are high and everything else. So it would be, and trying to envision that and think about what would I do in that situation is very tough, because looking around, when I was there was no one there as far as a crowd or, people mad or whatever the case is. So looking around, things are a lot more calm now. I had time to think, I had time to envision what I would do if this, if that, and if I saw this. But when stuff hits the fan, it's a little more real, so to speak.
Yeah. And initially the law enforcement thought there were multiple shooters. The first reports on the news were they thought it was 3 or 4 shooters from like a high rise,
right?
Shooting down. Dan, when you kind of saw what was going on there and saw the footage, what went through your mind in relation to your experience?
I mean, it's chaos. You can never be ready when something like that happens. Most of the reports say that it was a very calm protest from the beginning.
Yeah.
Police officers at the protest had actually relaxed to the point where they were taking photos with protesters and actually had a kind of a good thing going on.
Sure.
And I'm sure they're still on high alert, but they weren't thinking about that at the time. Most of these police officers, it seemed, thought this was going pretty well. This was a peaceful protest, like people had been wanting to see, and things just happened.
Yeah, this guy here, he wasn't part of that protest at all. He was on his own. He did his own thing, and he endangered, obviously, the protesters. One of the civilians was hit, Shatamia Taylor. She was hit. She survived, and she was saying prayers for the fallen officers, while she was hospitalized. So I mean, it affected the residents there, the civilians. In that type of gunfire, you guys are taught to, is it take cover or go straight to where you hear the gunfire, or a little bit of both based on the terrain?
It's a little bit of both. You're taught to get to the gunfire, but you can't go to the gunfire if you don't know where it's coming from. So to take cover for a second, gather yourself, find out what you need to know. Mm-hmm. But then, you have to move towards the threat at some point.
Okay. And then Sean, there were 5, well, we didn't know this till, once all the dust settled, but there were fallen officers there. Is it something that during that type of gunfight, you just, you would just walk by or run by your fallen officer just to still focus on the task at hand? I mean, there's really nothing else you can do for the man at that point.
Right.
How would you mentally kind of surpass that kind of obstacle?
One of the things that we did a lot was train. So, and some of our trainers were SWAT guys, and they said, listen, if I'm down, you carry out that fight. Your job is to neutralize that threat. So if I'm down, if I'm out of the fight, then I'm no good to you. So you need to continue on. You need to go and neutralize that threat, and then let somebody else behind me worry about me. So right. Is it difficult to do? Absolutely. But at the same time, you know what you need to do, because if you stop, your attention's on your fellow officer. Now, the person who's shooting at you or your fellow officer, they can take you out and take the next officer out. So you need to go neutralize that threat.
Right. Okay. And then Dan, I know the police department caught a lot of flack from people because they sent the robot in with the C4 to blow this guy up. What are your thoughts on that at this point?
Listening to Sergeant Larry Gordon, who was the negotiator, speaking with Micah Johnson at the time, who was a suspect, he had been speaking with him from, I know the estimates are anywhere from about 2.5 to 4 hours.
Yeah.
he made the determination this guy was not going to give up. This guy was set on what he was doing. He was going to carry this out to the end. And they made a split-second decision, not a split-second decision, but a decision on the spot to neutralize this the best way they could. And you can second-guess it over and over again, but unless you're in that situation, and I would never second-guess these guys because I wasn't in that stairwell with them that day. I wasn't on that floor. And I'm sure they thought about what they were going to do. And at the time, it was, we need to end this before more people get hurt. And they made the decision. It worked. And you can second guess it all, but they had to make that decision. I didn't have to. I'll never second guess them.
When you guys have gone to calls, even like, calls that aren't as serious, maybe hypothetically a convalescent home or something where there's not really, you wouldn't really think there would be a threat. Is it always in the back of your mind that any call could be an ambush? Are you trained that way, Sean?
I would say yes, because you never know what a person's mindset is. So if you recall, maybe I would say maybe 2 years ago when I believe it was either Downey or a department in that area that responded to a traffic collision. And in their mind, it was just a simple traffic collision. Traffic collisions occur every single day, probably hundreds of traffic collisions throughout California. Now, these officers were gunned down, responding to a traffic collision, not knowing that the person that crashed had just killed his cousin and also had a stolen car. So you have to, as bad as it may sound, you always have to be on high alert, responding to any call, because it could be an ambush, or you simply don't know what the person's intentions are.
That is so wild, because not too long before the 2016 ambush, some guy rolled up to Dallas Police Headquarters and just started firing. I don't know if you guys remember that, firing into the building. They chased him. He was in a van. Now the van was loaded with gun slots and all kinds of stuff to fight back and shoot back. They ended up having to, they shot the engine block out with, I think, a 50 cal. He ended up parking at a Jack in the Box. They were in pursuit of him. It was about 10 miles away. And then they had to blow the van up, and then they shot the guy, with the 50 cal. But I think at that point, there's really nothing else you can do because you're endangering. Like Sergeant Gordon said, you have to go in now. We can't afford to wait because this guy could just come out blazing. I mean, he was just exchanging gunfire down that hallway. It was just, Dan, any other thoughts in regards to, engaging in gun battles and gunfire with suspects?
I mean, it's just something you always have to be prepared for. You never know what the situation is going to be. One of the biggest misconceptions I think police have when it comes to the general public is the general public likes to second guess us based on what the call turned out to be and not what we knew at the time going in. We don't have all the information, so we're always on high alert. We're supposed to. That doesn't mean you don't get lackadaisical from time to time, but we try to avoid that. But yeah, you should always go in with that mindset that this could turn into something and I need to be prepared. And people we're dealing with need to understand that that's the mindset we're coming in with, and they need to help us out a little bit by being a little more understanding of.
Right.
We're not getting, this is only this, so we don't need to be prepared.
Right. And then Sean, I think you told me that you're trained to overcome. So you're not trained to just make it cool. Like if someone has a knife, you need to overcome that situation. Do I have that right?
Correct. So anytime you are in any situation, you are trained to overcome whatever use of force that other person has. So if it's a hands, then you need to use an impact weapon or pepper spray or taser, something like that. So, and that is done to basically affect an arrest, no more, no less. So the person that officers are dealing with, they're the ones that dictate how much force we use. Are we up here? We down here? It's really and truly up to them. So I've never come across a person that said, okay, I'm guilty, and turn around and almost put handcuffs on themselves. That does not happen. So a lot of people do not want to go to jail. So they'll do any and everything in their power to not go to jail. Right. And understand, people in the public need to understand, anytime you're taking a person to jail, On camera, it looks very ugly because people resist. So you can ask any of these citizens that had to assist an officer and ask them how difficult it was, even if there were 4 or 5 citizens, how difficult it was to have one person put their hands behind their back if they don't want to. You can YouTube all these videos and you can see all these citizens also struggling. People say, well, they don't have training. There's still 4 or 5 people against one. So once again, it looks bad on camera, but a person that does not want to go to jail, it's going to be difficult.
Okay, and then speaking of that, and I'll close it out on this, I'll ask you, Dan, has the use of cell phones recording you guys helped or hurt?
Yeah, it's just another obstacle. It shouldn't affect your job. If you're doing your job right in the first place, it shouldn't bother you. But on the other hand, it's forcing us to be second guessed by people who are watching a situation and not understanding, like what Sean just said, how difficult that situation is. When somebody decides they're going to fight, I'm not going to use the same force as him. I'm going to go above and I'm going to get the job done. But that, of course, 9 times out of 10, that doesn't look pretty. It's made it harder than it should be, but it shouldn't affect our job. As long as you're doing your job right, you're going to come out okay.
Okay, and then one last thing for you, Dan, before we go to Sean's thoughts on it. The disrespect now for law enforcement, is that kind of taking you back a little bit?
The disrespect now has definitely escalated compared to, say, 5-6 years ago. It's definitely at an all-time high. I mean, it's annoying and it is a nuisance and it has made our job harder, but it's just something else we have to deal with. We can't stop doing our job because of it. There's still a lot of innocent people out there. There's still a lot of good people out there that deserve protection from us and deserve our help. And we're not going to leave them hanging because we're getting disrespect. The problem is when you start getting the disrespect that we're getting a lot from politicians and people not supporting what we're doing. And they're only doing it for votes. They're doing it to try to pander to the general public. That's when it starts to hurt. I can handle it from the general public. When the politicians start to turn on us, that's when it becomes a problem for law enforcement.
Okay. And then we'll go to you, Sean. Same question, the cell phone usage.
I personally never cared about the cell phone usage. Do not interfere. If I was making an arrest, I would tell people just stand back. And then if you want to get me, zoom in, and I'm fine with that. But don't interfere. Unfortunately, a lot of people, they want the narrative to fit their story. So they'll cut it and edit it and, say this and say that and everything else to fit whatever narrative that they're trying to get past.
Right.
So I could care less because, like Dan said, if you're doing the right thing, you have nothing to worry about.
Okay.
But if the camera in and of itself is a great tool, but you need to look at the entire movie, so to speak, in order to get the complete story, not just cut and paste here and a little bit here and a sound bite there. That right there does not tell the entire story.
Okay, and then your thoughts on the treatment of officers nowadays, the respect-wise.
It's unfortunate. From my experience, most people don't care about the police until they need the police. So you could listen to a certain song or you can do this and you can do that, but it's not until you need the police that you see how valuable that they really and truly are. People don't understand when you go to the bank late at night, it's because there's an officer somewhere close by is the reason why you're not getting robbed. Right. People don't understand that because as I know plenty of criminals and criminals tell me, man, if y'all wasn't up and down this street, man, I rob and steal and from each and every house on the street.
Right.
But because you guys are visible, okay, now I need to take my action somewhere else, or I need to slow my roll, or whatever the case is. Just having officers available makes people safe. They don't realize it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the two of you taking the time to spend with me on this and giving me your insight. And I want to thank you again. I'll get with you guys later, and I appreciate the time.
Hey, thanks for having us, man. I appreciate it.
All right.
No problem, Mike. Good talking to you, man.
All right, fellas, I'll be in touch.